July 7, 1944. A German signals officer sits in a reinforced bunker near Calais, studying the latest intelligence reports with growing confusion. 24 hours earlier, his maps showed a vast concentration of British and American forces massing along the Kent coast, a clear and present threat to the Pas-de-Calais sector. Now, remarkably, they have vanished. 50,000 soldiers have simply disappeared. The German High Command faces an impossible choice. Are these troops being held in reserve for a second invasion, or have they already landed elsewhere? In this moment of profound uncertainty, standing in a control room 3 miles from Dover, a small team of British officers achieves something far more powerful than destroying an enemy army. They have made the enemy afraid of an army that doesn't exist in the numbers they imagine. This is the story of Operation Fortitude South, the greatest deception campaign ever mounted, a masterpiece of military misdirection where phantom divisions and ghostly armadas held German reinforcements in place for weeks, bought with nothing more than careful lies, false radio transmissions, and an extraordinary faith in one simple principle: that what the enemy believes to be true matters far more than what actually is. The problem that faced the Allied High Command in the winter of 1943 was mathematical in its brutality. The German army possessed 58 divisions stationed in occupied France, with another 12 in reserve elsewhere in Europe. A successful invasion would require somehow convincing the Germans to distribute these forces as thinly as possible, to scatter them across hundreds of kilometers of coastline, to second-guess themselves at the moment when doubt mattered most. The intelligence reports were sobering. The Germans controlled the terrain. They had spent 4 years fortifying the Atlantic Wall, constructing millions of tons of concrete defenses, mines, and anti-tank obstacles. They possessed interior lines of communication, meaning they could move reserves more quickly than the Allies could reinforce a beachhead. They had achieved local air superiority in many sectors. The statistics were unforgiving. Any direct amphibious assault would meet prepared defenses and rapid counterattacks. History suggested that such operations bled away like color from old cloth. Dieppe in 1942 had cost thousands of men for nothing. The Allies needed the Germans to be wrong about where the invasion would come. They needed more than that. They needed the Germans to remain wrong, to commit themselves to a false belief so completely that even when evidence to the contrary appeared, they would rationalize it as deception. How do you convince an enemy commander that an invasion is coming somewhere else, and then convince him to keep believing it even as the real invasion begins? The answer came not from a single innovation, but from the orchestrated application of multiple deception techniques, coordinated by a section called D Division, part of the London Controlling Section, operating from a nondescript building in central London. The men and women who ran this operation understood a fundamental truth about military intelligence. Armies respond not to reality, but to what they believe reality to be. The brain behind much of this was D Division's commanding officer, who understood that deception is not simply a matter of lying, but of creating an alternative narrative so complete, so internally consistent, and so psychologically convincing that the enemy cannot help but believe it. The technical apparatus was extraordinarily complex. The British had broken German codes and possessed intimate knowledge of how German intelligence processed information. They knew what questions German commanders asked, how they verified information, and what sources they trusted. This knowledge became the blueprint for deception. First came the creation of the phantom formations themselves. The Allies established a fictional First United States Army Group, or FUSAG, nominally under the command of General George Patton, stationed in southeast England with its supposed headquarters near Dover. This was not merely a matter of printing false documents. The entire apparatus of a modern army was replicated. False radio stations broadcast to create the impression of a massive force. Radio operators sent genuine military traffic, including training exercises and administrative messages. creating a background noise of military activity that German signals intelligence could intercept. The quantity was staggering. Thousands of radio messages that added up to no actual information but conveyed the impression of enormous scale. Dummy camps were established across Kent, Sussex, and Essex. These were not crude affairs but elaborate facsimiles of real military installations. Painted canvas, trucks, mock-up landing craft constructed from scaffolding and wood, inflatable tanks positioned with attention to shadow and sightline so that reconnaissance photographs would show them as authentic armored vehicles. The scale was astonishing. Approximately 4,000 dummy vehicles and 500 mock landing craft were positioned across southeast England, visible to German reconnaissance aircraft, creating the impression of an invasion force of hundreds of thousands. Supply depots with false manifests were established. Dummy fuel storage facilities were constructed and then destroyed in simulated air raids, creating false evidence of Allied losses that German intelligence incorporated into their assessments of Allied strength. The crucial element, however, was human intelligence. The British had turned German agents, or the Germans believed they had agents reporting from England when in fact the agents were entirely fictitious constructs. These double agents, controlled by MI5 and working under the case name Operation Double Cross, sent regular reports back to German intelligence, and these reports were crafted with meticulous care. They reported what German intelligence wanted to hear, but framed within a framework of plausible detail that made verification difficult and created internal contradictions that kept German commanders uncertain. One agent, Garbo, who operated from London, became so trusted by German intelligence that he was eventually awarded the Iron Cross. The information he sent was carefully constructed to steer German belief toward believing the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, that American forces were being held in reserve, and that the entire operation was a double bluff with a second invasion planned. The messages included genuine tactical information interspersed with false strategic assessment, making the false information seem more credible because it was embedded within genuine detail. If you are finding this fascinating, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The more subscribers we have, the more we can explore these remarkable stories. When the actual landings began on June 6, 1944 in Normandy, the deception mechanisms accelerated rather than ceased. The Germans had to be convinced that the Normandy landings were the diversion, and that the main invasion was still coming at Pas-de-Calais. The Phantom Army continued its radio transmissions. The double agents continued their reports, now indicating that the real invasion would follow within days. The German 15th Army, which defended Pas-de-Calais, received orders to remain in place. Even as German High Command realized that Normandy was the actual invasion, they retained hope that a second, larger invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais. This hesitation, this uncertainty, this division of German military attention lasted weeks. Crucial panzer reserves that might have reinforced Normandy remained instead waiting for the phantom invasion that never came. The Germans ran their own deception operations in response. Recognizing that they might be the subject of deception, German intelligence established counter-deception measures. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, began assessing which reports were likely false. However, the Germans were simultaneously attempting to deceive the Allies about German strength, creating a hall of mirrors where both sides were trying to determine which information was authentic. The Germans believed they had invented techniques of strategic deception that were more sophisticated than anything the Allies possessed. They maintained elaborate false information about German military deployments and capabilities. The difference was critical. While German deception operations were largely effective against the Germans themselves, creating confusion within their own military hierarchy about actual German strength and position, the British deception operations were focused outward, creating a false perception of Allied capabilities and intentions. The American equivalent, while utilizing some of the same Phantom Army techniques, operated differently and on a smaller scale. The American 12th Army Group used some dummy equipment and false radio traffic, but American deception operations lacked the sophisticated intelligence integration that characterized the British effort. The American approach was more straightforward, more reliant on creating the appearance of vast numbers through physical dummies. The British approach was subtler, more integrated with intelligence operations, more dependent on understanding the precise psychology of German decision-making. Where the Americans created the impression of numbers, the British created the impression of strategic uncertainty. The historical impact of this deception campaign remains contested because its effects were fundamentally psychological rather than material. No lives were saved by fortitude because no battles were won through it directly. However, the German 15th Army was moved from Pas-de-Calais to Normandy until weeks after the landings had begun. The 7 panzer divisions that remained in German reserve were committed piecemeal rather than as a coordinated counterattack. German command and control was fragmented by uncertainty. The cumulative effect of this delay and distraction was measurable in casualties and in the difference between a breakout from the beachhead that succeeded within days and one that took weeks. The deception bought time, and in amphibious operations, time in the beachhead phase is the most valuable commodity that exists. The campaign demonstrated something that remains true in modern military operations: that intelligence operations can achieve strategic effects that kinetic operations cannot. You cannot kill an enemy force with false information, but you can paralyze its decision-making. What happened to the Phantom divisions after June 6th? They were gradually stood down. The dummy installations were dismantled. The radio broadcasts ceased. The double agents sent their final reports. The apparatus of deception, which had consumed enormous effort and resources to construct, was quietly disassembled. The men and women who ran Operation Fortitude returned to other duties, and the operation itself became, for many years, something that could barely be discussed. The secrecy surrounding deception operations was extraordinary. Official histories omitted any mention. Veterans who had participated were bound by secrecy restrictions so stringent that they could not even discuss their service with their families. For decades, the operation remained largely unknown outside of official circles. It was not until the 1970s, with the release of intelligence files, that the full scope of the deception became clear. Even today, certain aspects remain classified, and the precise breakdown of which German officers believed which deceptions, and for how long, remains partially obscured by the fog of history. The surviving elements are few but significant. In the National Archives at Kew, thousands of documents detail the planning and execution of the deception. The surviving dummy installations have been dismantled or dispersed. Fort D, near Gravesend, where some of the mock-up facilities were constructed, still stands but is now largely unknown. The radio stations that transmitted the Phantom Army's communications have long since been decommissioned. The double agents, some of whom lived long after the war, took their experiences to their graves, bound by the Official Secrets Act. Yet the operation survives in a more important sense. It survives in the decisions that German commanders failed to make, in the reinforcements that never arrived, in the strategic uncertainty that pervaded the German High Command in June 1944. Standing in that bunker near Calais, the German officer looking at those vanished forces could not have known that he had just experienced the culmination of months of careful, meticulous deception. He could not have known that the very documents he was reading, the very radio intercepts he was analyzing, had been carefully constructed to deceive him. He could not have known that an entire apparatus of false information had been designed specifically to exploit the logic of his own thinking, to use his own rational processes against him. But that is precisely what had happened. 50,000 soldiers did not disappear from German maps because they had been mysteriously transported elsewhere. They disappeared because German intelligence had been convinced that they existed where they never actually were. The greatest victory of Operation Fortitude was not that it successfully deceived the Germans. It was that it taught the Germans to doubt their own certainty. In war, doubt is a weapon more powerful than any shell or bomb. The British Ghost Army had no soldiers, no tanks, no guns. It had only the power to make an enemy believe in its own elaborate fiction, and that, as it turned out, was enough.